Tracing Doja Cat back to the Muppets. Doja Cat won a People's Choice Award in 2020. Miss Piggy attended the 2015 People's Choice Awards. That's it. Tracing Bill Murray back to the Muppets. Bill Murray was in the 1986 film Little Shop of Horrors, which was directed by Frank Oz, who was good friends with Fozzie Bear and Miss Piggy. That's it. Tracing Karl Marx back to the Muppets. Marx's doctoral advisor was Bruno Bauer. Bauer in English means pawn. And who's the king prawn? This guy, Pepe, aka a Muppet. That's it. Tracing the Spanish Civil War back to the Muppets. The Spanish Civil War started in 1936, which is the same year that Jim Henson was born. That's it. Tracing the Beatles back to the Muppets. In 1967, their album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was released, which inspired the name and outfit choice for Sgt. Floyd Pepper. That's it. Tracing Caro Caro Bonito back to the Muppets. Caro Caro Bonito released a song called My Party, which is one letter away from Me Party, which is a song that was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Lynn Whitfield back to the Muppets. Lynn Whitfield was in the 2011 film All Things Fall Apart with Ray Liotta, who was in the 1999 film Muppets from Space. That's it. Tracing the Bible back to the Muppets. Library of Congress has a Gutenberg Bible. They also have a copy of the Muppet movie. That's it. Tracing Picasso back to the Muppets. A fictionalized version of Picasso is one of the main characters in the play Picasso at the Lapin Agile by Steve Martin, who was in the 1979 film The Muppet Movie. That's it. Welcome to part 4 of Tracing 2021 Oscar nominees back to the Muppets. Next up is Gary Oldman, who was in Batman Begins with Michael Caine, who played Scrooge in The Muppet Christmas Carol. That's it. Tracing Death Grips back to the Muppets. Death Grips' song No Love was featured in Season 1, Episode 11 of BoJack Horseman, which also featured Kristen Schaal, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Back to the Muppets. Zach Callison was in Mr. Peabody and Sherman with Ty Burrell, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Wallows back to the Muppets. One of the members of Wallows is Dylan Minnette, who was in the 2015 film Goosebumps with Jack Black, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Jack the Ripper back to the Muppets. Jack the Ripper and Kermit the Frog have the same middle name. Can you guess what it is? Time's up, it's the. That's it. Tracing Tyler the Creator back to the Muppets. Tyler the Creator was on the television series Kidding with Frank Langella, who was in the 2014 film Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Left Out London back to the Muppets. She's from Seattle, which serves as the backdrop for the movie Sleepless in Seattle starring Tom Hanks, who was in Cloud Atlas with Jim Sturgis, who was in Crossing Over with Ray Liotta, who was in the 1999 film Muppets from Space. That's it. Tracing Jimmy Carter back to the Muppets. On June 22, 1979, Jimmy Carter was the President of the United States, and the Muppet movie opened in movie theaters across the country. That's it. At the Piz back to the Muppets. Mr. Piz did the cinematography for the 2019 short film Unemployed starring Brooke Turner, who was in the 2019 film Pamela with Jacqueline Sidney, who was in the 2000 film Prom Queen with Rusty McGee, who wrote songs for Season 2 of The Wubbulous World of Dr. Seuss, which was produced by the Jim Henson Company. That's it. Welcome to Part 5 of Tracing 2021 Oscar nominees back to the Muppets. Next up is Stephen Yeun, who was on The Big Bang Theory with Jim Parsons, who played Human Walter in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Part 6 of Tracing 2021 Oscar nominees back to the Muppets. Next up is Viola Davis, who was in The Disappearance of Eleanor Rigby with James McAvoy, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Billy Joel back to the Muppets. That's it. Tracing Pedro Pascal back to the Muppets. He was on The Mandalorian with co-star Grogu, who was the same species as Yoda, who was built by Jim Henson, who created the Muppets. That's it. Tracing The Weeknd back to the Muppets. He was in Uncut Gems with Adam Sandler, who was in Hotel Transylvania with Selena Gomez, who had a brief cameo in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Bjork back to the Muppets. Bjork was in Dancer in the Dark with Stellan Skarsgård, who was in The Hunt for Red October with Tim Curry, who was in Muppet Treasure Island. That's it. Tracing Olivia Rodrigo back to the Muppets. She's a speaker and panelist for the Gina Davis Institute on Gender and Media, which was founded by Gina Davis, who was in the movie Tootsie with Charles Durning, who was in the Muppet movie. That's it. Tracing Will Smith back to the Muppets. He was in the 2005 film Hitch with Adam Arkin, who is the son of Alan Arkin, who hosted The Muppet Show in 1979. That's it. Tracing Bo Burnham back to the Muppets. He was in The Big Sick with Holly Hunter, who was in The Incredibles with Samuel L. Jackson, who did a Capital One advertisement with Kermit the Frog in 2015. That's it. Tracing Henry VIII back to the Muppets. He was married to Anne Boleyn, who was executed at the Tower of London, which is where the final scene of Muppets Most Wanted takes place. That's it. Tracing Sarah Paulson back to the Muppets. She was in the 2012 film The Time Being with Frank Langella, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Rachel Zegler back to the Muppets. She is currently filming Shazam! Fury of the Gods with Lucy Liu, who was in Charlie's Angels with Tim Curry, who was in Muppet Treasure Island. That's it. Tracing Mitski back to the Muppets. She briefly attended Hunter College, which is Vin Diesel's alma mater. Vin Diesel was in Boiler Room with Giovanni Ribisi, who was in A Million Ways to Die in the West with Sarah Silverman, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Winona Ryder back to the Muppets. She was in Heathers with Christian Slater, who was in Back to the Sea with Tim Curry, who was in Muppet Treasure Island. That's it. Tracing Taika Waititi back to the Muppets. He was in What We Do in the Shadows with Jermaine Clement, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Zendaya back to the Muppets. She was in Smallfoot with Jimmy Tatro, who was in The Wolf of Snow Hollow with Rookie Lindholm, who was on the 2015 ABC television series The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Bruce Campbell back to the Muppets. He was in The Ant Bully with Meryl Streep, who was in Julie and Julia with Amy Adams, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Jenna Fisher back to the Muppets. She was in the movie Hall Pass with Christina Applegate, who was on the Muppets ABC television show. That's it. Tracing Nicki Minaj back to the Muppets. She was in The Other Woman with Don Johnson, who was in Knives Out with Rookie Lindholm, who was in the 2015 television show The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Joshua Bassett back to the Muppets. He was in Dirty John with Connie Britton, who was in Me and Earl and the Dying Girl with Nick Offerman, who was on the 2015 ABC television series The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Kool-Aid Man back to the Muppets. His work life and his home life are virtually inseparable, much like the Swedish Chef, who is legally considered a Muppet. That's it. Tracing Danny Elfman back to the Muppets. He was in Corpse Bride with Johnny Depp, who was in Sherlock Gnomes with James McAvoy, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Homestuck back to the Muppets. One of Homestuck's most well-known fans is Dante Basco, who was in Hook with Robin Williams, who was on Sesame Street. That's it. Tracing Daniel Kaluuya back to the Muppets. He was in Sicario with Emily Blunt, who was in The Muppets 2011. That's it. Tracing Jack Nicholson back to the Muppets. He was in Terms of Endearment with John Lithgow, who was in Beatriz at Dinner with Salma Hayek, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Lord back to the Muppets. She was on SNL with Scarlett Johansson, who was in Marriage Story with Ray Liotta, who was in Muppets from Space. That's it. Tracing Will Arnett back to the Muppets. He was in Despicable Me with Jason Segel, who wrote and starred in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Adam Driver back to the Muppets. He was in The Report with Corey Stoll, who was in Midnight in Paris with Tom Hiddleston, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Jay Baruchel back to the Muppets. He was in This Is the End with Seth Rogen, who is on Muppets Now. That's it. Tracing Elliott Smith back to the Muppets. He went to Hampshire College, which is also the college that Liev Schreiber went to. Liev Schreiber was in My Little Pony, the movie, with Emily Blunt, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Chris Evans back to the Muppets. He was in Lobby Hero with Michael Cera, who was in Molly's Game, which was written by Aaron Sorkin, who also wrote The Social Network starring Andrew Garfield, who was in Tick, Tick, Boom with Joel Grey, who hosted Season 1, Episode 3 of The Muppet Show. That's it. Tracing Oliver Cooper back to the Muppets. He was in Project X with Thomas Mann, who was in It's Kind of a Funny Story with Zach Galifianakis, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Tobey Maguire back to the Muppets. He was in The Great Gatsby with Carey Mulligan, who was in Promising Young Woman with Bo Burnham, who was on Parks and Recreation with Nick Offerman, who was in the 2015 ABC series The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Phoebe Bridgers back to the Muppets. She is currently dating Paul Mescal, who is in The Lost Daughter with Olivia Colman, who was in The Mitchells vs. the Machines with Danny McBride, who was in Kung Fu Panda 2 with Jack Black, who was kidnapped by the Muppets in 2011. That's it. Tracing Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer back to the Muppets. Rudolph has a red nose, just like Animal, who is a member of the Muppets. Happy holidays. That's it. Tracing Michael Cera back to the Muppets. He was in the Lego Batman movie with Will Arnett, who was in Muppets Haunted Mansion. That's it. Tracing Dave Mustaine back to the Muppets. He performed on The Drew Carey Show. Drew Carey was in Robots with Halle Berry, who was in Kings with Daniel Craig, who was in Knives Out with former Muppet performer Frank Oz. That's it. Tracing Andrew Garfield back to the Muppets. He was in The Social Network with Justin Timberlake, who sang Rainbow Connection with a fake Kermit on Saturday Night Live in 2003. That's it. Tracing Timothée Chalamet back to the Muppets. He was in Interstellar with Michael Caine, who was in The Muppet Christmas Carol. That's it. Tracing Tom Holland back to the Muppets. He was in Cherry with Jack Rayner, who was in Sing Street with Aidan Gillen, who was in The Dark Knight Rises with Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who was in Season 1, Episode 9 of the ABC. Tracing Brandon Flowers back to the Muppets. He's a Mormon. Amy Adams was raised Mormon but left the church when she was 11. Amy Adams was in The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Fred Heschinger back to the Muppets. He was on The White Lotus with Jake Lacy, who was on The Office with John Krasinski, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Adam Scott back to the Muppets. He was on Parks and Recreation with Aubrey Plaza, who was on Muppets Now. That's it. Tracing Patrick Dempsey back to the Muppets. He was in Valentine's Day with Jamie Foxx, who was on Season 37, Episode 3 of Sesame Street. That's it. Tracing Haley Steinfeld back to the Muppets. She was in True Grit with Jeff Bridges, who was in Iron Man with Robert Downey Jr., who was in Mr. Willoughby's Christmas Tree. That's it. Tracing Leonardo DiCaprio back to the Muppets. He was in Catch Me If You Can with Amy Adams, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Christian Borle back to the Muppets. He was in Falsettos with Stephanie J. Block, who was in The Cher Show with Michaela Diamond, who was in Tick, Tick, Boom with Joel Grey, who hosted Season 1, Episode 3 of The Muppet Show. That's it. Tracing Mike Feist back to the Muppets. He was in West Side Story with Corey Stoll, who was in The Many Saints of Newark with Ray Liotta, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. Happy birthday, Mike Feist! That's it. Tracing David Harbour back to the Muppets. He was on Stranger Things with Finn Wolfhard, who directed the short film Night Shifts, starring R2 Nazareth, who was on Muppets Now. That's it. Tracing Richard Nixon back to the Muppets, he was born in Yorba Linda, California, which is the same birthplace as Sabrina Bryan, who was in the Cheetah Girls with Raven Simone, who was in The Pirate Fairy with Tom Hiddleston, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Anya Taylor-Joy back to the Muppets, she was in Glass with James McAvoy, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Orson Welles back to the Muppets, he was in The Muppet Movie. That's it. Tracing Willem Dafoe back to the Muppets, he was in The Hunger with David Bowie, who was in The Labyrinth, which was directed by Mr. Muppet Man himself, Jim Henson. That's it. Tracing Kieran Culkin back to the Muppets, he was on Succession with Nicholas Braun, who was in Princess Protection Program with Selena Gomez, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Alfred Molina back to the Muppets, he was in The Pink Panther 2 with Steve Martin, who hosted Season 2, Episode 8 of The Muppet Show. That's it. Tracing Bryan Cranston back to the Muppets, he was in Little Miss Sunshine with Alan Arkin, who was in The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Eric Andre back to the Muppets, he was in Popstar Never Stop, Never Stopping with Joan Cusack, who was in It's a Very Merry Muppet Christmas Movie. That's it. Tracing Don Cheadle back to the Muppets, he was in Hotel for Dogs with Jake T. Austin, who was in Wizards of Waverly Place with David DeLuise, who was the son of Dom DeLuise, who was in The Muppet Movie. That's it. Tracing Kevin Bacon back to the Muppets, he was in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles with Steve Martin, who was in The Muppet Movie. That's it. Tracing Jeff Daniels back to the Muppets, he was in Terms of Endearment with Shirley MacLaine, who was in Steel Magnolias with Dolly Parton, who is in Best Little Whorehouse in Texas with Charles Durning, who was in The Muppet Movie. That's it. Tracing Taylor Swift back to the Muppets, she was in The Lorax with Zac Efron, who was in 17 Again with Sterling Knight, who was in Season 1, Episode 14 of So Random with Miss Piggy. That's it. Tracing Alanis Morissette back to the Muppets, she was in Dogma with Salma Hayek, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Bill Hader back to the Muppets, he was in Forgetting Sarah Marshall with Jason Segel, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing James Caan back to the Muppets, he was in The Godfather with Marlon Brando, who was in The Score, directed by Frank Oz, who was an original Muppet puppeteer. That's it. Tracing Pierre Capaldi back to the Muppets, he was in Bean with Burt Reynolds, who was in The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas with Dom DeLuise, who was in The Muppet Movie. That's it. Tracing Johnny Knoxville back to the Muppets, he was in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles with Whoopi Goldberg, who was in It's a Very Merry Muppet Christmas Movie. That's it. Tracing Bradley Whitford back to the Muppets, he was in Tick Tick Boom with Joel Grey, who was in Season 1, Episode 3 of The Muppet Show. That's it. Tracing Axel Weber back to the Muppets. He was rejected from Juilliard. I was rejected from Juilliard. Jeremy O. Harris is aware of his existence. Jeremy O. Harris is aware of my existence. And true fans know that Jeremy O. Harris was friends with Hari Neff, who was in Assassination Nation with Joel McHale, who was on Community with Donald Glover, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Skeet Ulrich back to the Muppets, he was on Riverdale with Cole Sprouse, who was on So Random 7 episodes after Miss Piggy was. That's it. Tracing Pedro Pascal back to the Muppets, he was on The Mandalorian with co-star Grogu, who is the same species as Yoda, who is performed by Frank Oz, who is an original Muppet puppeteer. That's it. Tracing Will Ferrell back to the Muppets, he was in Blades of Glory with Will Arnett, who was in Muppets Haunted Mansion. That's it. Tracing Frank Sinatra back to the Muppets, he was in The Manchurian Candidate with Angela Lansbury, who was in The Pirates of Penzance with Linda Ronstadt, who hosted episode 523 of The Muppet Show. That's it. Tracing Lakeith Stanfield back to the Muppets, he was in Uncut Gems with Adam Sandler, who was in Bedtime Stories with Carrie Russell, who played Princess Charming in Cinder Elmo. That's it. Tracing Dylan Minnette back to the Muppets, he was in The Click with Bridget Mendler, who was on Season 4, Episode 1 of Good Luck Charlie with the Muppets. That's it. Tracing James Gunn back to the Muppets, he wrote and directed Super, starring Rainn Wilson, who was on The Office with Ed Helms, who was in the 2015 ABC series The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Simu Liu back to the Muppets, he was in Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings with Ben Kingsley, who was in Iron Man 3 with Robert Downey Jr., who was in Mr. Willoughby's Christmas Tree. That's it. Tracing Trey Parker back to the Muppets, he was in Despicable Me 3 with Steve Carell, who was in Dan in Real Life with Emily Blunt, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Rosie O'Donnell back to the Muppets, Miss Piggy hosted the first 2 segments of The Rosie O'Donnell Show on July 1st, 1996. That's it. Tracing Rose Byrne back to the Muppets, she was in The Place Beyond the Pines with Ray Liotta, who was in Muppets from Space and Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Oliver Stark back to the Muppets, he was in Mind Gamers with Sam Neill, he was in The Hunt for Red October with Tim Curry, who was in Muppet Treasure Island. That's it. Tracing Dolly Parton back to the Muppets, she was in Romeo and Juliet with James McAvoy, who was in Muppets Most Wanted, Emily Blunt, who was in The Muppets, and Michael Caine, who was in The Muppet Christmas Carol. That's it. Tracing Dan Povenmire back to the Muppets, he was on Phineas and Ferb with Carol Kane, who was in The Muppet Movie. That's Tracing Paul Dano back to the Muppets. He was in Looper with Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who was on the ABC series The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Danny Pudi back to the Muppets. He was on Community with Donald Glover, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing David Tennant back to the Muppets. In 2018, he made a cameo in The Muppets Take the O2. That's it. Tracing Lin-Manuel Miranda back to the Muppets. He was in Speech and Debate with Darren Criss, who was in Muppets Haunted Mansion. That's it. Tracing George Michael back to the Muppets. In 1974, he recorded the song Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me with Elton John, who hosted episode 214 of The Muppet Show. That's it. Tracing Tyler, the Creator, back to the Muppets. He was on Kidding with Frank Langella, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Ben Barnes back to the Muppets. He was in The Big Wedding with Topher Grace, who was on the ABC series The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Jenna Ortega back to the Muppets. She was on You with Kathy Griffin, who was in Muppets from Space. That's it. Tracing Hideo Kojima back to the Muppets. He collaborated on PT with Guillermo del Toro, who wrote and directed The Shape of Water, starring Michael Shannon, who was in Knives Out with Frank Oz, who was an original Muppet puppeteer. That's it. Tracing Emlyn Hughes back to the Muppets. He's from Barrow in Furness, just like Karen Taylor, who was in Angus Thongs and Perfect Snogging with Aaron Taylor Johnson, who was in Avengers Age of Ultron with Robert Downey Jr., who was in Mr. Willoughby's Christmas Tree with Kermit the Frog. That's it. Tracing Amy Winehouse back to the Muppets. She won the Grammy for Best Pop Vocal Album 2 years after Kelly Clarkson, who was in Ugly Dolls with Wanda Sykes, who was in a deleted scene from the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Homer back to the Muppets. He wrote The Odyssey, which is about Odysseus coming home to his wife Penelope, which is the same name as the 2006 movie, starring James McAvoy, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Mitski back to the Muppets. Her album Bury Me at Makeup Creek is a reference to the Simpsons episode Faith Off, co-starring Don Cheadle, who was in Talk to Me with Taraji P. Henson, who was in Muppets Haunted Mansion. That's it. Tracing Matt Stone back to the Muppets. He was in Run, Ronnie, Run with Jack Black, who was kidnapped by the Muppets in 2011. That's it. Tracing Q from Impractical Jokers back to the Muppets. He was in Impractical Jokers, the movie with Will Ferrell, who was in Megamind with Tina Fey, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Giancarlo Esposito back to the Muppets. He was in Pinheiro with Rita Moreno, who hosted episode 105 of The Muppet Show. That's it. Tracing Clint Eastwood back to the Muppets. He was in Million Dollar Baby with Ricky Lindhome, who was on the 2015 ABC series The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Kirsten Dunst back to the Muppets. She was in Drop Dead Gorgeous with Amy Adams, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Marissa Tomei back to the Muppets. She was in Loverboy with Sandra Bullock, who was on episode 107 of Muppets Tonight. That's it. Tracing Hugh Dancy back to the Muppets. He was in Our Idiot Brother with Elizabeth Banks, who was on the ABC series The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Watership Down back to the Muppets. It stars John Hurt, who was in Thumbelina with Carol Channing, who hosted episode 423 of The Muppet Show. That's it. Tracing Curtis Connor back to the Muppets. Connor?
I hardly know her.
Not to be confused with the 2013 movie starring Amy Adams, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets.
Okay. Bop bop.
That's it. Tracing David Bowie back to the Muppets. He was in Labyrinth, which was directed by the Muppet Man himself, Jim Henson. That's it. Tracing Devin Bostick back to the Muppets. He was in Small Time with Christopher Maloney, who was in Man of Steel with Amy Adams, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Dead Meat James back to the Muppets. On episode 104 of his podcast, a guest stars Mike Doherty, who directed Krampus, starring Allison Tolman, who was in Killing Gunther with Bobby Moynihan, who hosted The Muppets Take the Bull. That's it. Tracing Minecraft Monday back to the Muppets. Monday comes before Tuesday, not to be confused with the actress Tuesday Weld, who was in Falling Down with Robert Duvall, who was in The Godfather Part 2 with John Cazale, who was in Dog Day Afternoon with Charles Durning, who was in The Muppet Movie. Tune in to Minecraft Mondays on Mondays at 10 p.m. Eastern on Brass Monkey 534 on Twitch. That's it. Tracing Kathy Bates back to the Muppets. She was in The Day the Earth Stood Still with Jennifer Connelly, who was in Labyrinth, directed by Muppet Man himself, Jim Henson. That's it. Tracing Patrick Kottner back to the Muppets. He was on the George Lucas talk show Secret Holiday Show with John Hodgman, who was in The Invention of Lying with Ricky Gervais, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Charlie Cox back to the Muppets. He was in Betrayal with Tom Hiddleston, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Idris Elba back to the Muppets. He was in No Good Deed with Taraji P. Henson, who was in Muppets Haunted Mansion. That's it. Tracing Eugene Levy back to the Muppets. He was in Cheaper by the Dozen 2 with Steve Martin, who was in The Muppet Movie. That's it. Tracing Andrew Rannells back to the Muppets. He was in The Prom with Keegan-Michael Key, who was on the 2015 ABC series The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Gilbert Gottfried back to the Muppets. He was in Thumbelina with Carol Channing, who was on episode 423 of The Muppet Show. That's it. Tracing Nick Swartzen back to the Muppets, he was in Blades of Glory with Will Arnett, who was in Muppets Haunted Mansion.
Tracing Markiplier back to the Muppets, he was in Smosh the movie with Michael Ian Black, who was in Take Me Home Tonight with Topher Grace, who was in the pilot of the 2015 ABC series The Muppets. That's it.
Tracing Rachel Bloom back to the Muppets, she was in the Angry Birds movie 2 with Jason Sudeikis, who was on Carpool Karaoke with the Muppets. That's it. Tracing Brendan Fraser back to the Muppets, he was in G.I. Joe, The Rise of Cobra with Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who was on the 2015 ABC series The Muppets. That's it.
Tracing Bruce Lee back to the Muppets, he was in The Way of the Dragon with Chuck Norris, who was in Dodgeball with Jason Bateman, who was on the 2015 ABC series The Muppets. That's it.
Tracing Will Smith back to the Muppets, he was in Men in Black 3 with Jermaine Clement, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Bob Odenkirk back to the Muppets, he was in Little Women with Saoirse Ronan, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Brie Larson back to the Muppets, she was in Unicorn Store with Joan Cusack, who was in It's a Very Merry Muppet Christmas Movie. That's it. Tracing Adam Sandler back to the Muppets, he was in Hubie Halloween with Ray Liotta, who was in Muppets from Space. That's it. Tracing Leslie Grossman back to the Muppets, she was in Studio 666 with Dave Grohl, who was on the 2015 ABC series The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Joseph Quinn back to the Muppets.
I really like that you call me Joseph, by the way.
He was in Time Wasters with Samson KO, who was in Our Flag Means Death with Rhys Darby, who was in Arthur Christmas with James McAvoy, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it.
Tracing Adil Akhtar back to the Muppets, he was on Les Miserables with Joseph Quinn, who was in Stranger Things with Finn Wolfhard, who wrote and directed the short film Night Shift starring Artur Nazareth, who was in Muppets Now. That's it. Tracing Alex Brightman back to the Muppets, he was in Here Today with Kevin Kline, who was in The Pirates of Penzance with Linda Ronstadt, who was on episode 523 of The Muppet Show. That's it. Tracing Ewan McGregor back to the Muppets, he was in August Osage County with Chris Cooper, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Jodie Comer back to the Muppets, she was on Killing Eve with Sandra Oh, who was in The Night Listener with Robin Williams, who appeared on the cover of the Winter 1983 Muppet magazine. That's it. Tracing Joe Keery back to the Muppets, he was in Free Guy with Utkarsh and Budkar, who was on the 2015 ABC series The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Tom York back to the Muppets, he did the music for the movie Suspiria, which starred Chloe Grace Moretz, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing Joe Keery back to the Muppets, he was in Spree with John DeLuca, who was in Muppet Babies episode 208. That's it. Tracing former Australian Deputy Prime Minister Michael McCormack back to the Muppets. He's from the town of Wagga Wagga, which is the same place that Dame Edna Everage is from, and she was on Jay Leno in 2006 with Billy Crystal, who was on episode 103 of Muppets Tonight. That's it. Tracing Tatiana Maslany back to the Muppets, she was in Violet and Daisy with Saoirse Ronan, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it. Tracing my friend Rachel back to the Muppets, she ushered the Sandy Duncan concert, and Sandy Duncan was in Rock-a-Doodle with Ellen Greene, who was in Little Shop of Horrors with Steve Martin, who was in the Muppet movie. That's it. Tracing Neil Cicerega back to the Muppets, he did music for Gravity Falls, starring Kristen Schaal, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Charles Martinet back to the Muppets, he was in the film 9 Months with Joan Cusack, who was in It's a Very Merry Muppet Christmas Movie. That's it. Tracing Weird Al Yankovic back to the Muppets, he was interviewed by Fozzie Bear for the fall 1984 issue of Muppet Magazine. That's it. Tracing Lana Del Rey back to the Muppets, she was in a Gucci commercial with Jared Leto, who was in House of Gucci with Lady Gaga, who was in Lady Gaga and the Muppets Holiday Spectacular. That's it. Tracing Andrew Garfield back to the Muppets, he was in Under the Silver Lake with Topher Grace, who was on the 2015 ABC series The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Mitski back to the Muppets, her album Bury Me at Makeout Creek is a reference to season 11, episode 11 of The Simpsons Faith Off, starring Don Cheadle, who was in the movie Flight with John Goodman, who hosted episode 104 of Muppets Tonight. That's it. Tracing Halle Berry back to the Muppets.
Check. Raspberry. Halle Berry.
That's it. Tracing John F. Kennedy back to the Muppets, he was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald, who was played by Neil Patrick Harris, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Zooey Deschanel back to the Muppets, she was in Our Idiot Brother with Rashida Jones, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it. Tracing Chris Pine back to the Muppets, he was in The Princess Diaries 2 Royal Engagement with Julie Andrews, who hosted episode 217 of The Muppet Show. That's it. Tracing Jenna Ortega back to the Muppets, she was on You with Kathy Griffin, who was in Muppets from Space.
That's it.
Tracing Freddie Mercury back to the Muppets, he was portrayed by Rami Malek in the film Bohemian Rhapsody, and Rami Malek was in No Time to Die with Christoph Waltz, who was in Muppets Most Wanted. That's it.
Tracing John Stamos back to the Muppets, he was in Muppets Haunted Mansion. That's it.
Tracing Adam West back to the Muppets, he was in Chicken Little with Zach Braff, who was in It's a Very Merry Muppet Christmas Movie. That's it.
Tracing Hiroshi Fujioka back to the Muppets, he was in Submersion of Japan with John Fujioka, who was in Some Kind of Hero with Richard Pryor, who was in the Muppet movie. That's it.
Tracing Gillian Anderson back to the Muppets, she was in Playing by Heart with Dennis Quaid, who was on episode 207 of Muppets Tonight. That's it.
Tracing Elton John back to the Muppets, he was on episode 214 of The Muppet Show. That's it.
Tracing Rhys Darby back to the Muppets, he was in Jumanji Welcome to the Jungle with Jack Black, who was in the 2011 film The Muppets. That's it.
Tracing Will Wood back to the Muppets, he's from New Jersey. Jason Alexander's from New Jersey. Jason Alexander was on episode 108 of Muppets Tonight. That's it.
Tracing James Acaster back to the Muppets, he was in Cinderella with Pierce Brosnan, who was on episode 204 of Muppets Tonight. That's it.
Tracing Noah Schnapp back to the Muppets, he was in Hubie Halloween with Ray Liotta, who was in Muppets from Space and Muppets Most Wanted. That's it.